So we've learned that the cell is the smallest unit of a living thing that is alive, and that all living things are made of cells. And we can think of cells like the building blocks of all living things, similar to bricks or Legos. But now we're going to look at what is inside of a cell and the things that make it work. So the first thing that we have that we're going to look at is the cytoplasm. And that's the environment of the cell. And most of the cell is made up of cytoplasm. It's a fluid mixture that contains the organelles and compounds that a cell needs. It's mostly made of water. So the cytoplasm is fills the space. So it's filling this whole space. So all of these things that you see are inside the cytoplasm. The next important thing that we're going to look at is the nucleus. The nucleus is like the brain of the cell. If you look here, these are onion cells, and each dot that you see, right here, these dark dots, those are each a nucleus. The nucleus is a cell structure that contains nucleic acids, like DNA and RNA, which are the chemical instructions that direct all of the cell's activities. So it's like the command center of the cell. It's surrounded by a membrane that only allows certain things to pass through, which is called the nuclear membrane. So only certain things can get in and out of the cell, the nucleus. The nucleus contains, like I said, the DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. You don't need to know the full terminology for DNA, but you do need to know that DNA is the genetic material that contains information passed from parent to offspring. So from parent to child, it's like a blueprint or a recipe within the cell. And the amount and order of DNA parts creates genes that are the information that control an offspring's traits. For example, eye color, hair color, whether someone is left-handed or right-handed, whether someone is male or female. All of those things are contained in the genes, which are part of the DNA, which make up the DNA. We're also going to look at the endoplasmic reticulum. So there are two types. There's smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and there's rough endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum, you can think of it like the highway of the cell. And so here it is, and this is also we also abbreviate it ER. And this organelle is responsible for transporting proteins throughout the cell. So it's like the highway. It's where the proteins travel from one part of the cell to another part. So all of this is endoplasmic reticulum. The ribosomes are like the construction workers of the cell. So their job is that they use the instructions delivered from the DNA of the nucleus to create the proteins. So the ribosomes create the proteins, and then they send them, the proteins get sent down the endoplasmic reticulum to other parts of the cell. And proteins are the molecules that the cells use to perform biological functions. And so all those dots here are ribosomes. They're the ones that they're making those proteins that they get the instructions from the DNA. So you can see how all of these things are working together to make the cell function. The next thing that we're going to look at is called the Golgi body, or it's also called a Golgi apparatus or Golgi complex. It's this part right here. And that is an organelle that receives the proteins. So we've got our ribosomes, right? So we've got our DNA from our nucleus, which sends instructions to the ribosomes about how to make the proteins. The ribosomes make the proteins, send the proteins down the endoplasmic reticulum to the Golgi body. Golgi bodies take the proteins, package them, and they distribute them where they need to go throughout the cell. So we think of them like the post office of the cell. And so here you can see protein packages being pinched off and shipped off by the Golgi body. So here's the protein. They're pinching them into little balls and sending them out throughout the cell. Next, we have the mitochondria. The mitochondria are like the power plant of a cell. And so different cells have different amounts of mitochondria. The more mitochondria are found in cells with greater energy demands. So muscle cells has more mitochondria than a fat cell. So here's a muscle cell, or here's an example of the mitochondria, which is the plural form. Mitochondrion is one. And it's the power plant of the cell, and it's a cell structure where food, in the form of glucose, and oxygen are combined to create energy molecules, known as ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which again, you don't need to know that the cells can use to function. So this takes the glucose and it combines it with oxygen and it creates energy molecules and sends them out to the cell so that the cell can function. We also have the cell membrane. Sometimes it's also referred to as the plasma membrane, and that's just the edge here. It's a protective cell structure that controls which substances can enter or leave a cell. So it's like the skin of the cell. It's semi-permeable, which means that some things can get through it, other things cannot. And so you can see here, some things are entering through the cell membrane into a cell. It contains doors, not real doors, but that's how we describe them, that only certain things with the correct key can get through. So only certain things can get through the cells, the cell wall, at certain places. Water can freely pass through, depending upon the concentration inside and outside the cell. So water can pass through, but depending on how much water is outside of the cell, how much water is inside of the cell can become saturated, which means it has enough water it can't hold anymore, and then in which case the water would not go through. But generally speaking, water can freely go through the cell membrane. Plant cells, and only plant cells, have a cell wall. Animal cells do not have a cell wall. The cell wall is like the walls of a building. It's the outer layer of a plant cell. It's made from cellulose, and it protects the cell by providing a rigid structural support for the cell. So it has cellulose in it. It gives shape to the cell and structure, like it firms it up, it gives shape to it. And the reason being that plant cells have a cell wall and animal cells do not is that plant cells have no, there's nothing rigid about a plant. It doesn't have bones like animals do. Excuse me. So it needs something to protect it, help it to be stand up and be firm, and so that is where the cell wall comes in. The cell wall contains cellulose, which is fibrous and is difficult to digest, and about 33% of plant matter is cellulose, and the cellulose is the most common biological molecule on Earth. And so this rigid outer portion of a plant cell is the cell wall, and inside that, this other, you can see it a little bit right here. You can see the difference between this one and that one, where that little line is of still brown. That is the cell membrane. So plant cells have both a cell membrane and a cell wall. We also have vacuoles in cells. It's like a storage closet of a cell. Vacuoles, their job, they store food, water, and waste for the cell. So this right here is a vacuole in a plant cell. We also have them in animal cells, but they're much smaller in an animal cell than they are in a plant cell. So that's the difference. They both have them, and a plant cell is much larger than an animal cell, the vacuole. Next we have the chloroplast. This is what we were looking at when we were looking at our elodea leaves. Those are those green circles. And they're like solar panels. They capture sunlight and glucose molecules. And again, this is another thing that's found only in plant cells. And they're like batteries that store the energy. So it's an organelle in plants that captures the sun's light energy with the molecule chlorophyll. So the chlorophyll is what gives a plant that green color. The energy is stored as chemical energy in the form of glucose during photosynthesis. So the chloroplasts in plants are where photosynthesis occurs, because that's where the chlorophyll molecules are kept. Okay, please go to Edmodo and take the quiz, and make sure you have your visual notes for class tomorrow.